Hello, and welcome to our Protest in American History. This is our Women's History Month protest lecture, and if you have been attending, this is our fifth in our series. So if this is your first time, welcome. If you've come to all of them that we've been doing, welcome to that again. Today we have three dynamic speakers who are going to be talking on various topics concerning women's history. We're so glad you are here today. Make sure to ask questions in the Q&A and be sure also to fill out the attendance form at the end. I know that many of you want those extra credit points and we would like for you to be able to receive them. So just a little bit about Women's History Month. Women's History Month, according to womenshistorymonth.gov, started out as a national celebration in 1981. And Congress passed requested a proclamation from the president for a week to be called Women's History Week. And that was in 1982 that we got a Women's History Week. And the next 5 years, there was a week in March that was then Women's History Week. But they started more and more started pushing for a Women's History Month. And so basically between 1988 and 1994, there were requests to authorize the president to proclaim March of each year as Women's History Month. And since 1995, our presidents have issued series of annual proclamations designating the month of March as Women's History Month. And so thanks to that, we now have really wonderful presentations, really interesting events going on. And we'll post a link also for other events that we're doing here at TCC for Women's History Month. And there are several. We have an amazing Google site to kind of guide you through that. And even in spring break week, when we don't have any programming going on, you can still go to the library's website and be able to see some really great exhibits and still participate in online events through that. So welcome. I'm going to be your host and moderator today. I am Dr. Chloe Northrup, and I am on the Northeast campus, and I work in the history department. Our Q&A is going to be moderated by Dr. Karen Wisely, who is also from the Northeast campus. Our three speakers today are Kimberly Cox, Dr. Kristen Faust, and Misty Wilson Mertens. And Misty and I are kind of the co-hosts then for the whole protest series. So we're just really excited now to be able to do our fifth one. And we have one more in April. Last month we had Black History Month, and this one is for Women's History Month. So ignore our slide, it's Women's History Month this month. So our first speaker is Kimberly Cox. And Kimberly Cox has been involved in the teaching and practice of law and government for 20 plus years. She started out as an adjunct instructor on the Northwest campus from 2000 to 2019. She's been an instructor of government at TCC Connect from 2020 to 2021. She is also an attorney at law in Texas and the District of Columbia, and also a certified teacher for the state of Texas. And her first talk is going to be on the suffragettes. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Kristen Faust, and we will hear her after Kimberly's talk today. Kimberly, if you'll go ahead and unmute yourself, we are ready for you to begin.
Sorry about that. Welcome. Hi, everyone. We all know that protests are an important part of American life and history. However, when we hear about protests, we tend to think about events like the Boston Tea Party, the Whiskey Rebellion, or men such as Martin Luther King Jr. But what about women? Women have not been emphasized in our history books and classes as much, but with 2020 being the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment and this month being Women's History Month, I wanted to give a brief introduction to some of the protests of women who I think played an important part in the push for a constitutional amendment and the woman's right to vote. I apologize, it's not moving forward. There we go. The suffrage movement was one that grew out of the abolitionist movement, and women were prominent players in both and learned a lot about how to organize, speak out in public, and lobby through their association with the movement. Many will recognize the name of women such as Susan B. Anthony, which you see, and many will and in the slide you can see she was extremely active and vocal in the movement. She participated in large petition drives, founded important women's organizations, and even defied the law by voting illegally in a presidential election. But while Susan B. Anthony and her 19th century contemporaries and colleagues began the suffrage movement in 1848 in Seneca Falls, it will be the women of the 20th century, a second and third generation of suffragists who will light a fire under the movement and push for change through protest and more radical means. Why the 20th century? I argue it's because of what they call the new woman. In the 1890s, you start to see young women with their hair pinned back under elaborate hats, striding down streets more confidently. They were not wearing the corsets and the petticoats of their mother's generation. They were in high-collared shirt waists and long-tailored skirts, like you can see. And their hems rose scandalously several inches off the ground to accommodate pedaling bicycles around town. They went to work. They've been doing that since the Civil War, and they took advantage of things like new restaurants, theaters, places they could go, and embraced independent living in what was known as the bachelor girl. And you'll see the writing there is about the bachelor girls on the slide. But no longer were women just meant to stay home and raise children. They were moving beyond the home and going to school, starting careers, and young men also were embracing this change somewhat. They would often support the new woman and the bachelor girl. So what you see is there's a cultural shift or tipping point that's happening where women are going to feel more empowered, they have more educational and career opportunities than ever before. Let's go forward. In the 1890s, the National Women's Suffrage Association would be born to help propel this movement forward, and their main purpose was securing the right to vote for women. The approach they took, though, was a state-by-state approach. So you'll see Wyoming on the map. It's going to be the first one to sign suffrage into law in December of 1869. Colorado will follow suit in 1893, but it's going to be 14 years after that before another state would act. So basically, it's really painfully slow. It's a difficult process, and many women coming into the movement were ready for radical change. In 1910, Dora Lewis, who you'll see there, is a prominent executive member of the NAWSA along with other women, and they began to voice their concern and urge the group to create a national campaign for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. They felt that at the time, Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, who are the leaders of the NAWSA, were not doing enough. And you can see in the slide there that she's pretty radical. She is arrested multiple times out having on their back. She spent about 83 days in jail for working within this movement. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns are contemporaries of Doris Lewis and are an integral part of the change we'll see as well. Lucy Burns is a graduate of Vassar and Oxford. She joined what's called the Women's Social and Political Union while in England. This is the militant suffragist movement led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters in England. She will meet Alice Paul at this time, but Burns will spend more time in England and then in Scotland, whereas Paul will return back to the United States in 1910. Burns is unique. She spent more time in prison than any other American woman suffrage, and she leads this thing, which I thought was fascinating, called the Prison Special Rail Tour in 1919. It's a 15-city tour that is basically meant to spread the horrors that the women endured while in prison after being arrested during their times for protesting the right to vote. Alice Paul had been in England, obviously, as a British suffragette too, and I'm not going to go too much into the oops, I need to get back one. I apologize. Alice Paul had been in England too. I won't go too much into the British suffragette movement and the Pankhurst, but if you Google them, you'll see that they're a lot more radical. Jailings, force feedings, bombings, fires with destruction of property are all used to kind of get the attention in that movement in Parliament. But Alice Paul participated in that while she was in England in school. And so she's very familiar with these radical, I guess, techniques. As soon as Paul arrives back in the United States, she's already very well known, and she will join the NAWSA as the chair of what they call the Congressional Committee. So Alice Paul and Lisa Burns set up the Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C., and within a year, the two women had also formed what was called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. It'll first act as a subgroup of NAWSA, and so the Congressional Committee, or the CU, was a minor committee at the beginning, because most of the major movement was still focused on a state-by-state change. The CU, however, was allowed to organize a parade to publicize the right to vote to Congress and also to President Woodrow Wilson, who'd be just coming into office. The parade is held on March 3rd, 1913, and this is prior to the day that Woodrow Wilson comes to, prior to his inauguration. When he arrives, he comes to the train station and it's empty, which is unusual. And he's told that no one's there because everyone is at the women's parade. So at the women's parade, there's a lot of numbers that are kind of thrown around. I picked 8,000 because they say it's between 5 and 10. They're going to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And the parade started off peacefully. It's led by, you can see her on the horse there, Inez Milholland. She's actually a NYU School of Law graduate and a labor law attorney at the time she attends this parade. And basically, as the women start down the parade route, 250,000 approximate men gather in the streets, tell insults, sexual propositions, manhandles, spit on the woman, and police basically did nothing or very little. One officer was overheard telling the woman that they should even stay home where they belonged. The women actually hold their ground, and the U.S. Army troops come in after an hour of waiting and clear the streets back open so the protesters can continue, and they did. News media coverage was nationwide, and many would sympathize with the peaceful women's movement against the violence of the men. The news, in fact, dominated Wilson's inauguration and first month or so in office. Now, the NAWSA, they thought this was terrible. They thought that it was dangerous, and they're going to basically cut ties with Paul and Burns and the CU at this point. So in June of 1916, Paul and Burns and the CU formed the NWP, known as the National Women's Party, and they became an aggressive counterpart to that slower state-by-state approach that the NAWSA was taking. Paul sent two suffragists to 6 enfranchised states that existed in 1914, and these 2 representatives per state were to advise basically women in these states to oppose any and all Democratic Party candidates. Also in DC, her team would aggressively lobby Congress and question basically at work or in public places why they weren't supporting women's right to vote or how they were supporting. Congress's lobbying was not successful early on, so the target becomes President Wilson. On December 5th, 1960, in fact, they send members to Wilson's annual address to Congress, and they sneak a banner under their coat and unfurl it while he speaks, and it says, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" About a month and a half later, the NWP began a 2.5-year campaign of protests in front of the White House. This, and I got to go back, I apologize. Keep skipping. Yep, there we go. This is the Silent Sentinels, and many of the protesters are from the women's group from the NWP will stand outside the White House and protest with banners, and you'll see, we'll talk about the burning that's happening in the big picture in a second. But again, these women will stay there for 2.5 years, taking turns, and even during World War I, the NWP will keep up their picketing. During all of this, Paul was very media savvy. She used the press frequently to get attention for the movement. Stories were written that spotlighted the plight of women and galvanized more support for these movements. But after 6 months of the Silent Sentinels picketing, arrests began. There's no law at this time against what they're doing, so they're arrested for obstructing traffic. There's no traffic on the sidewalk. They're standing firmly on the sidewalk, but they're still arrested. And they basically the punishment for this is up to 60 days in the Algonquin workhouse in Virginia, which was terrible. I looked at news clippings from Alice Paul, and she reported spoiled, worm-infested food, physical abuse, rats, and so on. But the optics, because all this was getting printed in the news, were terrible for Wilson and Congress. So in October 17th, you see Paul personally protest. She's sentenced to 7 months, and she'll go on a hunger strike with some of the other women. And those who would not eat, some of them were actually force-fed with the tube, which would go up their nose or down their throat, and apparently it was extremely painful. The press, again, trying to get press for all of this, initiated a death watch for Alice Paul. And again, this looks extremely bad for the president. And so by late November, President Wilson will release all the women. In January of 1918, he actually finally endorses the amendment for women's suffrage, but it'll pass the House, and then the Senate is where it'll get hung up. So they're going to basically change tactics. They're still going to, lobby the president and out in front of the White House, but also they're going to picket the Senate more. The picture that you see that looks like a fire under a cauldron, that's the Watch Fires for Freedom campaign. And I love this. It's a large Grecian urn filled with wood harvested. And I had to double check this because I was like, really, that they did this? It was from a tree in Philadelphia's Independence Mall. And they literally, it's a real fire. They'll set it up to burn in front of the White House gates. And they basically write down President Wilson's words about freedom and all, because they're fighting World War I at this time period, and burn his words as hypocrisy. So during one of the worst periods of arrest during these Watch Fires for Freedom, 22 women were arrested. And that's the kind of yellowed picture you can see on the slide. That's that event. So by the end of January, 29 suffragists were on hunger strikes in the prison, but you'll still have others continuing on to basically keep that flame burning. It was a constant flame that would burn. On June 19th, 1919, the 20th Amendment finally passes both the House and the Senate, but now it had to be ratified by the states. So the NWP would go on a lobbying campaign at the state level at this point for the remainder of 1919 through the summer of 1920. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state needed to ratify, so it's official on August 26, 1920, where the Secretary of State of the United States signs the amendment into law. And the picture there is basically Alice Paul unfurling a banner for suffrage for the amendment based on that ratification. And she hand sewed a lot of that particular banner, so I think it's kind of neat. And lastly, the fight for women's rights continues, we know, today. But thanks to these women and more, we've come a long way, I think. We've seen a lot of large movements like the Women's March in 2017. That's the Me Too movement. And looking at that one still, even though the George Floyd protests, I think now are technically the largest, this Me Too movement march in 2017 is still statistically the largest single day movement. We've already mentioned that March is Women's History Month, so I love the picture. You can go, and I can put in the chat here in a second some resources. But there's on their site, you can find a lot of fun stories and pictures like the Waves World War II division of the U.S. Naval Reserve there. And also, too, there is an online National Women's History Museum. That's the "and she could be next" portion of the slide. Congress has basically looked at the building of this museum on the National Mall. They haven't done it yet. It's still pending, so it's just an online piece at this point. But they have a lot of really, really good activities going on throughout the month because of Women's History Month, and I encourage y'all to check it out. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cox. And our next speaker is Dr. Kristen Faust. Dr. Faust earned her PhD from the University of North Texas in 2017. Her dissertation was Exposing the Spectacular Body, the Wheel, Hanging, Impaling, Placarding, and Crucifixion in the Ancient World. Oh my. She has published several articles in the Encyclopedia of Women in Religion on goddesses, gender roles, and ancient marriage. She teaches U.S. history and world history courses at Tarrant County College on the Southeast Campus and Greek, Roman, and medieval history courses at the University of Texas in Arlington. Thank you, Dr. Faust, for taking back the night.
Thank you. for that introduction. Hi, I'm Dr. Faust, and I'm talking about the Take Back the Night movement. And I'm pushing slide button, so bear with me. There it goes. So what it is, what it isn't, the Take Back the Night movement is a women's protest, annual protest that started in the 1970s. It has nothing to do with Justin Timberlake, for those of you who are wondering. He wrote his song Take Back the Night with no clue about this movement and ongoing protest. But when he found out about it, he said that he hopes the song brings awareness to the issue. So what the issue is a protest. Again, it started in the 1975 officially, but women started doing marches and independent one-off protest in 1971 to protest against violence against women, sexual crimes, and sexual assault and rape. And so the marches, speakers, protests, candlelight vigils, these all take place, and typically once a year in April. And the point of the movement, again, is to bring awareness and to protest violence against women. And I think I might have to double click to make my slide move. Yes. Okay. So how it started and what some of the precedent and background that's going on. So as I mentioned, we have rallies and protests and individual one-off events that are happening around 1971, 72. And this is my parents' generation, and what they're doing is protesting against rape and violence against women. But this is just random, right? It's an individual university, an individual city. For example, we have in New York a protest against snuff pornography, which is where usually a woman gets literally killed on screen in the making of a porn. Well, this is probably didn't actually happen, but it was widely believed that it happened. And so we're having protests against it. And another thing that's happening is very frequent sexual assault and violence against women in the form of rape. And so we have several protests that are going on about that. And it's actually radical feminists in the 1970s that start speaking out against raping women. And you're thinking, that's not very radical. We should all be speaking out against raping women. But in the 1970s, it was radical feminists who are doing this. And the reason is because you just didn't really talk about it. It was kind of taboo. And so you have these victims of sexual assault or violent crimes against women that feel hushed and feel as though they can't speak out. And just to put some background to that, in the 1920s, as Mrs. Cox was telling us, in the 1920s, women didn't have rights to vote. Well, there's more to the story there. It was legal until the 1920s for husbands to abuse their wives. This is kind of the context that we're coming from. So 50 years later, we get into the 1970s. This is my parents' generation, and it was still very hushed to speak out if you were a victim of sexual or violent crimes. And so, well, not necessarily violent crimes, but let's say sexual crimes. So this is the context that we're in, that it takes radical feminists to start marching and protesting this. And so they're one off until we get to 1975. And we have Susan Alexander Spieth. She is a microbiologist. She's a professor. She's walking home from her university. She's a few blocks from her house, and she was violently stabbed to death. Okay, she was not raped. This is just a violent murder that happened. And so we kind of, at her death, get a coming together of several different groups across the nation and even across the world, standing up and saying no more violent crimes against women, no more sexual assault crimes against women. And so we officially in 1975, with Susan Alexander Spieth's death, get the first Take Back the Night protest. And this is how the movement is named. It's actually based on the newspaper here for the huge march and rally. It was actually a visual, so everybody has candles and they're marching through the streets to mourn her death and to expose this type of behavior. This happens in Philadelphia in 1975. And based on this newspaper article where it says West Philly poised to take back the night, that's how the movement gets its name. So the following year, 1976, in Brussels, Belgium, we have the International Tribunal of Crimes Against Women meeting there. And this is a meeting where more than 2,000 women from all over the globe meet together to discuss unsafe conditions for women and to come up with strategies to protest it. So we start having annual protests at this point globally under the name of Take Back the Night. So we have marches, rallies, speakers, and for the most part, these movements are going to be led by college students. So it's really Spieth's death that sparks these movements. And a very interesting and I think sad thing about the movement is that you can actually find more online about Spieth's husband than you can find about her. So you can usually get like a couple of sentences that say, you know, she was murdered on her, she's a microbiologist murdered on her way home. But you can actually find her husband, who was a CEO of a toy making company. You can actually find his whole obituary online, which I think is very odd. So the protests start 1975, and then we have them ongoing. And so you have protests happening across the world, all over New Zealand, Boston, San Francisco, across the country in the United States every year against violence against women. Over time, the movement changed. It's not just violence against women, it's more targeted at sexual violence. So that's a gradual change that happens in the movement. And if we look at the movement today and the organization today, it's sexual assault and sexual crimes against both men and women, being a little bit more inclusive now. So the next couple of slides, I'm just showing you some images of the protest over the last 50 years. And what we can see in these, I think it's interesting because you can see, aside from their clothing styles, which change over the 50 years, basically the images look the same. They're marching in the streets and demanding some change to what's going on. And I want to emphasize that, again, most of these events are held and started by college students, led and organized by college students across the world. And one right in our backyard, UTA, hosts a Take Back the Night event every April. And it's one of their biggest events that the university has. And every year they do several events, and TCC also does several sexual assault prevention events every April as well. It's that Sexual Assault Prevention Month. I wanted to mention something else about these movements and these marches. So I very frequently have this conversation with my husband because I'm always doing, I seem to always be doing marches, whether it's raising money for cancer or Alzheimer's or doing women's marches and things like this. My husband says, what good does a march do? It doesn't fix anything. Everybody already knows cancer exists. Well, it's not actually true. Marches do make changes, and marches do fix things, and protests do fix things, and peaceful protests fix things. And I think we see several examples of this in our current environment as well as in our past. For example, the Selma March in Alabama that Martin Luther King helped lead. Of course, that one turns into Bloody Sunday, and we have Voting Rights Act passed after that. So of course, that's a big example, but I think we can say also the Black Lives Movement. We've seen several police reforms as a result of that, and there's currently an act in Congress based on that movement. So I think they do make change. And I think we can see that here as well with the Take Back the Night movement. A small local example, UT Chancellor, this is in 2015, the chancellor of all of the University of Texas campuses, so that includes UT Dallas, UT Arlington, UT Austin. The chancellor says, you know what, maybe we do need to do a sexual assault study on our campuses. Maybe we need to investigate what's going on. So the purpose of having these organizations, these marches, especially this Take Back the Night movement protest, it's the creation of state organizations and coalitions to help rape and sexual assault victims. It's making that change, not just putting pressure on your government leaders, your political leaders, but also your employers and demanding institutional change where unjust circumstances exist. And that's basically what this movement continues to be about. It also is providing agency and voice for victims. And this is something I really want to emphasize, because if you'll recall, in the 1970s, when this movement started, people felt like they couldn't speak about what had happened to them. They felt silenced. And that is a huge change that this movement has brought. So making the issue loud is going to help victims voice their experience, start healing, and get the help that they need. When the experience is unreported, then the problem persists. When it's silenced, then the abusers have more power. And I think some current examples we can see of people finally, 50 years after the beginning of this movement, finally we start to see some of the victims getting justice, and notice how many years it took. And so some famous names that you might recall over the last 4 or 5 years, we have Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, Larry Nassar, that's the USA gymnast doctor, if you didn't recall his name. The victims felt powerless, like they couldn't speak, and it's taken that long, 20, 30, 40 years for them to be able to speak out and voice what has actually happened. And movements like this giving credibility to their experiences. So while the movement began officially in 75, the Take Back the Night Foundation didn't start until 20 years ago in 2001. And this is when Katie Kostner, she is the first woman to speak about her experience of date rape publicly. So she nationally is speaking about her experience in date rape, an article published about her experience in the Times Magazine. She becomes, she starts the foundation of Take Back the Night. So it starts as an annual protest, and then it is turned into a foundation that does these events and provides support for victims. So her experience in speaking about it has fueled and opened the door for other people to speak about their experiences and to find healing and resources. And she's actually a big supporter of how this movement has really exploded even in the last 5-10 years, especially through the hashtag #MeToo movements that that Kimberly had mentioned to us. So again, the point is that if people have voice and can share their experiences, then that helps the population, the overall majority of everyone, to be more willing to realize how pervasive and deep the problem is and demand change and bring change to the issue. But we have to recognize that there is an ongoing need for this type of movement, as obviously the foundation still exists. So let's talk about that ongoing need. Reporting and being honest. And as we've noticed recently with the #MeToo movement, people feeling like they can state their problem and their experiences. And once we do that, we can be honest about fixing the problem. So what you're looking at here is a graph showing the number of rape or sexual assault victims in the United States. And what you might notice in the second to last year, 2018, an enormous jump in the number of women reporting sexual assault or rape in the United States. So the average number statistic of women who have experienced rape or sexual assault is 20% normally in a given year, 1 in 5 women. In 2018, the numbers jumped to 1 in 3, more than 1 in 3, 37% in 2018. I think we need to recognize how large that number is. That's huge. And it's not as though in 2018, all of a sudden, more women experienced sexual assault or rape. What's clear here is that more women felt that they could report sexual assault or rape in the year 2018. And we need to understand why. We need to consider why. And this is largely because the Take Back the Night protest movement and the Me Too movement, by the way, the foundation, the founder of the foundation, Katie Koester, helps with the Me Too movement. She goes around speaking for the movement. And so the Me Too movement that started in 2016 was really fueled by this Take Back the Night protest. And then in 2017, that's the one we all remember where it really exploded with social media. And then in 2018, we see that spike in numbers, and there's really no coincidence there that women clearly felt as though they could speak out and address their experiences. Another thing that happened, I think, that might have fed into this, again, that Women's March 2017, and then the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2018, these all fueled that issue of being able to state the issue and the problem. And I think that speaks to the effectiveness of the Take Back the Night protests as we see them. And I think that it also speaks to something that we do have an ongoing problem with a culture of sexual assault and rape in our society. I think we have to recognize that and talk about it so that we can actually address and fix the problem. I don't think we can have 1 in 3 women experience it and still deny that it exists. So the Take Back the Night Foundation hosts usually hundreds across the globe, hundreds of events every year, usually in April. This year, the main foundation is doing a virtual event on April 29th. But I encourage you to get involved with the efforts that TCC is doing. We have 3 events coming up in April, anti-sexual assault events. So we'll have a link for those at the end, and I encourage you to get involved with those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Faust. All right, so our final speaker today is Misty Wilson Mertens, who is our fearless co-host of the Protests in American History series. She is an assistant professor of history and social science and department chair for the TCC Connect campus. She received her master's in arts in American history from Texas Christian University, and her research primarily focuses on the role of religion in public life and politics, particularly on the effect in presidential and congressional campaigns. She is co-chair of the District Civic Engagement Work Team and was part of the team that was nominated for a 2020 Civvy Award. So join me in welcoming Misty Wilson Mertens for Not a Property Crime, Protests to Create Anti-Rape Laws and Culture.
Thank you, Dr. Northrup. So I put a picture of my daughter's first Halloween in here because Dr. Faust had included her picture of being Rosie, and I just wanted to show her that great minds think alike. So before we get into any great detail, I do want to let you know that I will be discussing sexual assault and rape, though not in graphic detail. I want to make sure that if this is going to be difficult for you, I give you the opportunity to like go get some coffee, get a sandwich, do whatever you need to do, and just come back and join us in 14 minutes if this is going to be difficult for you to hear. So we're going to start today with a discussion of the historical legacy of rape as a legal concept. Our modern word comes from Latin roots, and roughly translated, it means the abduction or kidnapping of a woman against the will of whatever male controlled her life. So this shows us really early the historical bias we're dealing with. It's not about what happened to the woman, it's about the loss suffered by the man, and particularly economic loss. In looking at laws, the first set of written laws comes from the Code of Hammurabi, created by a Babylonian king in 1750 BCE. That's what you're looking at right here. In this collection of 282 laws, we see the first conception of rape as a crime, but it's a property crime against the father of a virgin, as she was now damaged and would be less valuable on the marriage market. The matter is similarly dealt with in the Old Testament. You can check out Deuteronomy chapter 22 for discussion of that. We're going to jump ahead just a little bit and talk about English law. So this is where a bunch of our legal concepts come from, so it's important that we check in with what England's doing. So in 1275, we're going to see the first Statute of Westminster. This is going to be published under the reign of Edward I. And this is the first time rape is a felony charge. It extended protection to married women who are attacked by men other than their husbands. But it does not extend protection to women who are attacked by their husbands or women who became pregnant due to a rape. The actual quote from the law is, "Without a woman's consent, she could not conceive." Shortly after this, rape is reclassified again and it becomes a capital offense. However, this punishment is rarely used. One historian looks at rape cases in England between 1400 and 1430 and found there were 280 cases, but not one of them led to a conviction. The reason is that these male juries found that women either couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, or they were just as likely to be a temptress as they were to be a victim. To put this another way, more women are killed for being witches than men are convicted for committing rape. And one of those things is actually happening, and the other thing is not. Jumping ahead a little bit to the United States, we're going to start to see American laws change in the early 1800s. So American laws beginning in 1800 start to define rape as the carnal knowledge of a woman when achieved by force by a man other than her husband. So this stems from the legal principle of coverture, which basically states that a husband has authority over the person and property of their wives. Legally, a married man cannot be held to account for raping his wife because there's this legal fiction that once you marry, you become one person under the law. So our earliest activists that are going to change these laws are really going to focus on protecting children. The average age of consent was 10 years old in the United States, with some states going as low as 7 years old. In fact, the very first bill that's ever proposed by a female lawmaker in the United States is going to come from Colorado State Representative Carrie Clyde Hawley, who you're seeing here. And she sought to raise the age of consent to 21 years old. In the end, she is able to get it raised to 18, but not 21. So I want to note here that most of the laws we're discussing up to this point assume that the victim would be a white woman accusing a man of the same social class as her. But I have two historical examples that I want to point to because this isn't the shared reality of most women living at the time. So the first is the case of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. June 23rd, 1855, Celia is a 19-year-old enslaved woman who is going to kill the slave owner, Robert Newsom, after a years-long series of rapes. He purchased her when she was 14, and then at 19, she killed him. She is arrested, tried, found guilty, and condemned to death. During the court case, her argument is that in the state of Missouri, it says that it's a crime to take any woman unlawfully against her will and by force. The law doesn't designate between slave and free, it just says any woman. However, the jury found that an enslaved person, being property, lacks personhood, and that the enslaved can neither give consent nor refuse consent. In fact, the only time she was actually considered a person is when they arrested her and then when they put her on trial. The situation for free women of color is not much better. So there's a case in the early 1800s of Captain James Dunn, who's an upper-class white man. He commits a rape of Sylvia Patterson in New York City, who is a free woman of color. He is charged eventually with intent to seduce. He's found guilty, and then his entire punishment is that he's forced to pay $1 as a fine. I wanted to go through that historical background because I think it's important to see where we're coming from, to know what the modern movement's really fighting against and where they're starting from. So the anti-rape movement began after the second wave of feminism, really in the middle of the second wave of feminism, which occurs after World War II. Women are entering the workforce and colleges, they're fighting for economic and legal equality, and then our society is just changing very quickly. What you're seeing here is data from the FBI, and it shows that the rate of reported rape began to increase dramatically in the 1960s. So as women moved into more untraditional roles, there is a response, and there's an attack against women. By the 1970s, rape is the fastest growing, most violent crime in the United States, but the laws really hadn't caught up at that point. Anti-rape activism starts on a local level, a grassroots level. In 1970, protesters picketed a wedding in California because the groom was rumored to be a rapist. And in 1971, the New York radical feminists, after learning that one of their members had been raped, sponsored a Speak Out on Rape. This is a take off of the Teach In of the 1960s. So women gathered and they told their stories. This takes off, it happens across the United States, and the common narrative that emerges here is that women felt like, yes, they had been physically assaulted, but they've also been let down by the legal system. In 1973, we have 25 rape crisis centers that open across the country, and they were established not by state governments, not by the federal government, but by local activists. The rape crisis centers started educating the public on rape, and particularly the conception that rape is about power, not sex, and the lack of legal protections for women. They also provided services directly to women, including a telephone hotline service, face-to-face counseling, and guidance to get women through the criminal justice system that tried to pursue charges. What you're seeing here is 5 local Oceanside women who came together and formed a rape crisis center in San Diego, and that institution is still standing today. Like most social movements, it took one really tragic but well-known case for this to become something that becomes a nationwide movement. In 1974, Joanne Little, I know it looks like Joan, but she pronounced it Joanne, is an inmate at the Beaufort County Jail, and she's put on trial for murdering Clarence Allgood, a white prison guard, with the pickaxe that he used to threaten her with. If she's convicted, she was going to face an automatic death sentence. So across the United States, we have Joanne legal defense committees sprout up. They're going to collect money for her legal defense. There's a local chapter formed by Rosa Parks in Detroit, and all together, these clubs are going to raise $350,000 for her legal defense. There's even a popular song called Joanne Little. It's written by Bernice Johnson Reagan, and it's sung by Sweet Honey in the Rock. And it became something of an anthem for this movement. She's eventually going to be acquitted, one of the first women acquitted of this kind of crime in this situation. And that really brought this to the national attention and began talking about what these laws meant and if they were still correct and if we were pursuing this in the right way. So our protesters and activists here are really going to try to take this from 2 angles. They want to change the law, but they also want to try to change the culture. In 1976, NOW is going to form the National Rape Force as an umbrella organization for anti-rape activists. They're going to engage in extensive public education programs, including demands for local criminal justice reform, rape reform at the state level, and they're going to lobby for financial support of victims and a change in the way that victims are handled before the trial starts. They also engage in Take Back the Night marches, which you just heard about, and they really succeeded in making this a topic that was unavoidable. On the state level, you're going to see feminists and anti-rape activists focus on changing core aspects of rape laws. They focus on broadening the definition of rape, creating shield laws, and changing how evidence is collected and presented. Between 1970 and 1979, 49 states changed their rape laws. In many cases, these laws developed quickly because this is an issue that liberal and conservative factions could unite for. Nobody is pro-rape, so this makes sense. This comes very quickly. In 1976, Nebraska becomes the first state to make marital rape a crime, but by 1993, all states have made that a crime. Nationally, in 1975, Congress is going to adopt new rules for the federal rules of evidence, and these rules are going to create national shield laws. Shield law is the idea that a person's sexual history cannot be, a victim's sexual history, cannot be used against them during a court proceeding. Movements like this tend to come in waves, and so the first big anti-rape movement kind of drops off in the 1980s, but we're actually seeing a return to this. So there are a number of issues surrounding law enforcement and rape today that are raising concerns. Annually, we have about 125,000 rapes that are reported across the country. That's coming from the Atlantic. And in 49 out of every 50 rape cases, the alleged assailant goes free. This is due to many issues, but the most prominent are how the police handle these cases and that they have a strong incentive to manipulate crime data to show that they have low crime areas. So for an example, a police person could write this up as an assault rather than a rape. They can have it as a memo, which doesn't get reported to the national crime statistics the same way an actual case would. Another troubling trend that's developed recently is that police have actually started charging the victims with a crime. So in 2008, Danielle Hicks is an 11-year-old girl in Washington, D.C. She reports being raped repeatedly by two men. Police conducted little investigation into her intent. Instead, they interviewed her in a way that violates the guidelines for childhood sexual assault cases. They delayed the DNA analysis, and they misled her into giving contradictory statements. She was 11 years old. They confused her during their questioning. And so they charged her with filing a false report. If you want to make yourself just really, really enraged, Netflix has a show called Unbelievable, which is a drama, but it's based on reporting from the Marshall Project about a similar case in California. So activists today are concerned about the way that this is being handled, but also the delay in testing rape kits. In 2003, a 16-year-old high school junior, Megan Evos, was attacked and raped in her own home. She reported the crime and consented to a rape kit. 9 years later, she found out that her kit had never been tested. Had it been tested, it would have led police to a known criminal and serial rapist who attacked 6 women after Megan. She used this mishandled case to raise awareness about needed policy changes, and she is going to publicly expose that Memphis, her hometown, had over 12,000 untested rape kits in storage. She lobbied her city council over the objections of the mayor to allocate $3 million of tax revenue to test these kits. In 2015, she and a group of lawyers founded PEARL, which is the People for the Enforcement of Rape Laws. Basically what she's saying is we have laws on the books, but nobody's enforcing them. So the laws that we passed in the 1970s, now it's time for us to actually use them effectively. In 2015, the Obama administration is going to launch the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative to encourage cities and states to send untested kits to labs, to open new investigations, and to prosecute assailants. So far, the Justice Department has awarded $154 million to 54 jurisdictions. They have reported that 61,000 kits so far have been inventoried and about 45,000 have been tested. Police have questioned or reopened about 5,000 cases, and prosecutors have gotten about 500 new convictions or plea agreements. We're also seeing a lot of social science research come out of this. So there's a group of social scientists that are looking at these untested kits from 1993 to 2009. They have about 5,000 in their sample group. And from those cases, what we've learned is that the notes from police investigations sometimes barely filled up a page, a single page. In 40% of cases, detectives never contacted the victim. In 3 out of 4, they never interviewed the victim. Half of the investigations were closed within a week, a quarter of them were closed within a day, and rape kits were rarely tested. Cleveland is one of the cities that really gets focused on here. They had over 7,000 untested kits, and one of the kits they actually did send to get tested, they tested it because they suspected that the victim was on drugs, and so they used that kit to find drugs in the victim systems rather than to actually find her rapist. So like Dr. Faust said, this is an ongoing problem, and it's one that we're starting to see get more activism currently around. So if you are interested in getting involved and you feel passionately about this, I would recommend you look at two groups here: the People for the Enforcement of Rape Laws. That's that group that Megan founded in the mid-2010s. And then the Women's Center of Tarrant County. So I put some websites there, you guys can look at that, and they both tell you how to get involved and where to go. And I'm going to hand this back to Dr. Faust to tell you guys about what TCC has coming up.
Hey, yeah, so we have, as I mentioned, 3 events in April, anti-sexual violence events. So we have Teen Dating Violence Awareness Prevention on April 21st. We have Denim Day, Step Up and Stop Sexual Harassment. This is one we do every year where you wear your jeans, and but we're virtual this year, so we have it where we're actually doing an event to learn more about the problem and what you can do to stop it. And Before You Text, Sexting and Bullying Prevention. So these are all 3 events hosted by various TCC campuses. This QR code here gives you the link to TCC's events calendar where you can find the virtual links to those 3 events. I'm going to give you a moment to snag that if you want that QR code. So I'm going to count 3, 2, 1 before I hit my clicker. All right, and next, as always, what we've seen throughout all 3 of our presentations is that voting matters and that putting pressure on political leaders matter. And so I want to give a shout out about the upcoming elections. We know we all voted, or many of us heard about elections, if nothing else, for the presidential election that we just had, but there's upcoming elections too for mayor, city council, and school board. So depending on your city and your area, you might have different ones of these to vote. So you have to be registered before you can vote. The last day to register to vote is April 1st for this election season. Early voting starts April 19, and the last day to vote is May 1st. So for information on these your voting locations, and how to register to vote, this QR code takes you to the Tarrant County voter information and registration page. So I can give you some time to click on that. And I believe I'm handing to Dr. Wisely.
Yeah, thanks for these great presentations. It was very eye-opening for all of them. I think that we have some pretty good questions that have come in, and we'll direct these to the appropriate people. First up, for Kimberly Cox, Anonymous sent in a question that asked, why were the Western states the first to pass women's suffrage?
The Western states, it's a combination of 2 things. It's an opportunity to get women to the Western states, so men will move there, if that makes sense. If you think about the time period, there weren't as many people living in these Western states. The life is going to be a little bit harder, so the more women they can get there, the better. And it was white women. Women of color were not allowed to vote, so Native American, African American, etc. So there's, I guess, a 2-part answer. Get the women out there, encourage them, and a little bit of racism, or a lot of racism. So that's the answer to that one.
Okay, thanks. For Kristen, we had a question come in from Quenisha Sampson, who wanted to know if you have any kind of statistics about percentages of husbands who have raped their wives, and do you think that it is a controversial topic in the 21st century?
I do not have statistics about it, although that's a very interesting question. I do think it's a controversial topic, absolutely. And in fact, I think I forgot to mention it, but it was not illegal to rape your spouse until the 1990s. And I think we could say it is still controversial because there are still states that are ambiguous, I will say intentionally ambiguous in their laws about marital rape. For example, Oklahoma. So yes, it's controversial. Yes, it's still debated. I don't have statistics on it, but that's a great thing that we should all try to Google after this session.
For sure. Misty, why is there such a backlog of rape kits?
That depends on who you ask. There is a cost to actually processing them. So some police departments say, look, we just didn't have the funds to do this. But the fact that it's so systematic across so many departments shows that there's a bias in not doing it. The places that actually process rape kits very quickly are the abnormality, not the norm. But I think by raising public awareness and kind of shining a light on this, we're going to start to see that change. It's not going to be acceptable for that to keep happening for very much longer.
And the Violence Against Women Act that was allowed to expire, that was helping with the processing them, right?
It was, and then several states at the state level have various bills and laws that have been passed in the last 2 years. Texas had one that was debated, but we don't quite have the funding I'd like to see behind it. So we're in session right now in the Texas legislature. I highly recommend you guys contacting your representatives and letting them know that this is something you really care about.
Good suggestions. All right, Kimberly, Dale Topham comes in and asks, what is the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette? He speculated that maybe suffragette was used pejoratively, or it was an England versus America thing. And can you explain what your decision was to use suffragette in your presentation?
And it's a good question. And typically when you have these talks, you will kind of make a division between suffragette being the British side and suffragist being the more polite term used over here in America. But when you look at the division for kind of the old guard of the women's rights movement and the new, more radical protest side of things, even here in America, they embraced that word suffragette more. There's a magazine that the Pankhurst put out called The Suffragette, and I love their motto because it kind of sums it up. It says, deeds, not words. And really this younger generation that's right in the last 20 or 30 years before the 19th Amendment is passed, that's really what they want. They're tired of waiting. They want those deeds, not words. So a lot of the younger group will embrace this suffragette as more of an in-your-face term, throwing it back at the people who were trying to make them feel little. If you think about the word suffragette, meaning tiny, woman, they'll throw it back in their face as kind of a like, yeah, we don't care what you say. We're strong. We'll take it and run with it. So that's kind of I guess it's an old guard versus a new guard kind of decision and how you look at that movement.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Kristen, we're going to go back to you for an anonymous question, and I'm just going to read it straight off the question board. It says, as a survivor of domestic abuse, it's horrifying how hard it is to press charges on men still to this day. Even after my case was proved, I got a protective order which my abuser continued to break and was only given a month in jail. Why do women's lives not matter until we are killed? What can we even do to help save lives in the future?
I wish I had an answer for that. I think that it is very important for us to get louder and to join organizations and to do these demonstrations, because the more we talk about it and the more we demand justice and equality, the more we can get justice and equality. And as a historian, I don't want to say this next part, but what seems to be true in most protest movements is that once somebody gets killed and you have a martyr, the movement explodes and change starts to happen. So Emmett Till is an example of that. George Floyd is an example of that. I think we could go back to Roman history and say, Tiberius Gracchus as an example of that. I feel like that's when we see change start to happen, is when we get a martyr for the cause, and I don't like that. But I think what you said is true, unfortunately. So we just have to be louder and stronger, and we can't be silent. That's what perpetuates the problem.
Yeah, I'm going to put on my historian's hat for a second too, and address this because I think it's a little important. And part of what will help the situation a little bit here is what we've been talking about all day today, and that is showing up on the streets and showing solidarity and showing how many women are affected by all of these things. It's true that, the Selma March in the African American Civil Rights Movement changed things about voting rights, but the reason it did is because footage of what happened to those people who were marching peacefully and were met by violence made it through televisions all across the country and drew attention to the fact that this is happening. So it matters that people are out there telling their stories and marching and making, a noise about this. It also matters representation. In my class, we teach about, I know this sounds ridiculous, but the burning bed, that crazy Farrah Fawcett TV movie that happened in the late 70s, early 80s that kind of showed people that this stuff was happening, and it ends people's ability to deny it. So that's important too, I would say. Last question, or next question, I guess. It's part of a comment from Justin Rogers. He says, it was mentioned that as women broke away from traditional roles, such as during the 1960s, there was a general response from men and cases of rape actually increased. Today, women continue to break away from traditional gender roles, but it could be that the tools of technology and social media have brought a little more balance to the power dynamics within the United States. In recent years, while there have been more cases of sexual assault being reported, indicating that women are becoming more open to the idea of speaking out about their experiences, is there any evidence to suggest that society is turning a corner?
I'll jump in if nobody else wants to. So I do think we have some things to be positive about. The fact that we are outraged about the untested rape kits in and of itself is a positive thing. The fact that there's been reporting by ProPublica, the Marshall Project, the fact that it's been on the local news is a positive thing. The fact that we're seeing more women go into law enforcement, that's going to change the culture there. That's positive. I think we have a long way to go. I think that this cannot be allowed to sink under the surface, kind of what Dr. Faust was saying earlier. But the more that we shine a light on it, the more that we demand change, the more that we're likely to see that.
Okay, just a couple of more. First, Anonymous says, have the representatives of the state of Ohio addressed the issue of the lab kits and the police departments of Cleveland? I think that's for you, Misty.
They actually have. Ohio is actually one of the states that's working to get this taken care of. I am going to put a link in the chat for End the Backlog. This is an organization that specifically works on this issue. It's terrible that Cleveland had so many, but Cleveland did apply for money. They have asked for a grant, and they are submitting those cases to be tested. And they're allowing researchers to go through the data with them. So while it's horrible it happened, I would say they've been more open than some other departments about trying to fix the problem.
Okay, the last question we have, nope, isn't anymore. We got more. Joan Johnson says that the issue of underage brides is concerning to me. So many states allow that practice. Is there a group working on this issue that you know about? Anyone?
I do. I guess I do. There's the National Coalition to End Child Marriage. They're one of the biggest groups that I know about. They're looking to introduce, and I may get this wrong, so you might have to look it up. There's the United States Code. I think it's Code 18. It's around the 2000s. There's a federal law that basically, oh gosh, in a nutshell, doesn't actually allow, but doesn't make it hard either for states to allow marriage for 12 and up. It's kind of crazy. So you have like, what is it, 46 states that don't have any law in place. But I know that the National Coalition to End Child Marriage, they are a group that is working on that and trying to get legislation before Congress.
You know, something else that is interesting about that is in some cases you can get married underage, but you're not able to get divorced. So it's a nice little trick in the law there.
All right. Wow. That seems like a large loophole that needs to be closed. All right. That's all the questions that we have. I want to thank our speakers, Misty.
So if you're here for credit, which I'm assuming most of you are, there was just a link put in the chat. Please click on that, fill it out, make sure that you put your instructor's name on there so I can get them the correct names for who should get credit in their class. And then, as Dr. Northrup said earlier, we are also putting a link in the chat for the rest of the TCC Women's History Month events. So if you want to see what else we're doing this month, click on that link and it'll take you to a calendar and you can see what's going on.